You're listening to TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour with your host, the Director of Dixie Heritage, Dr. Ed DeVries.
As many of you know, I grew up in Chicago, and one of the things that I could do as a young boy in Chicago was I could take you all over the city as well as all over several places in northwest Indiana, out in Crown Point and Cherville and Munster and some other places, Gary, Indiana, and so forth, Hammond. And I could take you to all of the old Al Capone hideouts. I could show you the houses and the neighborhoods and say, yeah, that was one of Capone's hideouts, or that was one of Capone's hideouts. Different hotels, different bars, different places I could take you to. And I could tell you the stories and how they related to Al Capone. And so when I got a copy of the newest book from Shotwell Publishing, and it was about gangsters in the South, I thought, wow, I got to read this. And so I reached out to the author. His name is Philip Leigh. He is a historian who has written several War Between the States books. And now he's decided, as he's getting into his 70s, that there are parts of his own life and the history through which he has actually lived that he feels like those stories need to be told by someone who actually experienced them, because he said that, it's one thing to write about issues and happenings that occurred before your time, and you're interpreting the information that was left by others. He said, but an actual accounting of the history of the gangsters in the South, particularly Hot Springs, Arkansas, written by someone who lived and grew up in Arkansas during the time, he said that's a history that needs to be written before somebody else in a subsequent generation decides to write on the subject and maybe doesn't get it all right because they didn't have the first-hand knowledge. And so this is what we'll call contemporary Southern history. Actually, when we think of Southern history, sadly, we almost always think of the War Between the States era, the 1860s, maybe the 1860s and 1870s, maybe we include Reconstruction in that. But the truth is that Southerners were colonizing what are now these United States 20 years before the Pilgrims ever landed on Pilgrim Rock. And so Southern history spans a period of over 400 years. It begins 20 years before the Pilgrims, and it comes into the modern era. And so this is one of Shotwell Publishing's attempts to tell the whole history of the South, not just the history of the South that occurred in the 1860s and the 1870s. And so Philip Leigh has written a great book. My goal actually today was to interview Philip Leigh and talk about all of the books he's written. And then after we had briefly summarized his War Between the States books and the 24 articles that he had written in the New York Times' Disunion series, then we would speak at length about his book on gangsters in Hot Springs, Arkansas, and gangsters in Dixie. It didn't work out that way, though. We began talking about the last book at the beginning of the interview, and it just took up the entire time. And then I looked at my watch and realized we had been talking for an hour, and we were out of time, and we hadn't even got to the other material. So what we're going to do in today's broadcast is we're going to share with you the interview with Philip Leigh, and we're going to talk about his great book on gangsters in the South. And he's going to name names, and he's going to tell stories. In other words, it's not that the North had one group of gangsters, Capone, Lucky Luciani, and so forth, and then the South had a different set of gangsters. They were the same gangsters for the most part. And this is just the Southern operations of the gangsters, the lesser known part of their story, but yet still a very important part of the story. And to understand the whole mafia situation in the United States in the middle of the 20th century, you really have to understand the mafia situation in the South, particularly Hot Springs, Arkansas. And so Philip Leigh does a great job with that. And as far as talking to him about his other books, that's going to just have to be done at another time. We'll bring Phil Leigh back here in a couple weeks, and we'll talk about his other books. But right now, let's go right into our interview with Phil Leigh, and we're talking about gangsters in the
Oh,
South.
Ed, how are you?
Oh, I'm good. How are you doing this morning?
Fine. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir, I can. I see that you were born in Little Rock, Arkansas, and graduated from the Florida Institute of Technology.
Well, the whole story is I first graduated from the University of Arkansas at Little Rock, which is a branch campus of the University of Arkansas. And then I went to Northwestern University for a master's in business administration and got out of there in 1971. Then I worked for about 10 years in the investment business in Chicago and New York. And I went to, then moved to Florida, and I got my degree in electrical engineering after I moved here. So I was also earning a living while I got that degree.
Okay.
So actually my degree in my electrical engineering came like 10 or 12 years after I got my first undergraduate degree. But I don't list that in my bio because it just complicates and confuses everybody.
Okay.
I get an MBA in 71 and then a Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering in 82, and that just confuses people.
So have you lived in Florida then since 82, or have you?
Since 1979.
Okay, wow. And then you grew up in Arkansas, so except for a brief sojourn in Chicago, you've pretty much lived in the South your entire life then.
No, I lived 3 years in Chicago and 7 years and actually I lived 3 or 4 years in Chicago and I guess 6 years in New York City.
Okay. And, we're going talk about, of the books that you've written, we'll talk about the one that interests me the most at the end. And that is the book that you've written, The Devil's Town, Hot Springs, Arkansas, during the Gangster era. But
right.
Did your interest in gangsters begin when you were growing up in Arkansas, or did it actually begin when you lived in Chicago and New York?
Actually, what happened is that I'm currently age 70, and I began to realize that I'm not going to be around forever. So, and I also saw that the way that history is being reported is different than I remember. I mean, I lived through some of that stuff, and so I decided, I'm a writer anyway, so I might as well write down things that I think are important to me, before I'm no longer here. And so that was one of the things. I grew up in Little Rock, Arkansas. At the time, as late as 1964, the New York Times had an investigative reporter go down to Hot Springs, and he declared that was the largest illegal gambling center in the country as late as 1964. And it was not nearly as big as Las Vegas, but Las Vegas is legal. So that really opened up a lot of questions. How did all this illegal activity continue? And, who was involved in enabling it to persist? And it was a fascinating story.
So, so then your fascination with gangsters wasn't born in Chicago then. It was actually born while you were actually living in Arkansas.
It's really more of, no, it was not born in Chicago, but it was really more of reflecting on the past that I felt had never been adequately told, both in terms of the Civil War and Reconstruction and, the Hot Springs gambling. Hot Springs gambling was principally of interest to me because I did grow up in Little Rock, and it was only like 50 miles away. And toward the end of my time in Little Rock, it was a big news item. Ultimately, what happened is that Arkansas is one of the poorest states in the country, always has been during my lifetime. And the gambling interest could make sizable political donations. It wasn't until Winthrop Rockefeller became governor in 1967 that there was a man in the governor's office that was too wealthy to be bribed. I don't mean to say that all the other governors before that were bribed, but it's hard to avoid concluding that at least some of them were. But even those that were honest, the gamblers in Hot Springs knew that governors come and go. But the way that the law gets enforced is through the state police or through the local police, And that really doesn't change that much. It changed when Rockefeller became governor, because that was one of his campaign planks, and he could not be influenced to the contrary.
When Bill Clinton was governor of Arkansas, he was what they called the Dixie Mafia. Was that in any way related to, or the, future expression of the mafia that was operating back?
No, I know there's a lot of people that would like, for me to be able to say something like that, but I'm speaking strictly of gambling as it's done in Las Vegas now and in places like that. And that was all over because Rockefeller was governor from 1967 to 1971. So during those 4 years, he really ended it all. By the time Clinton became a politician, illegal gambling was over in the entire state, including Hot Springs. Now, when he was a boy, gambling was in progress at that time, and he says a little bit about that in his biography, about seeing the slot machines in the tobacco shops and places like that along Central Avenue, and seeing sometimes parents actually sitting, the slot machines with their children in their laps. But no, I can't address this question of Dixie Mafia. By the time he became governor, all of the history that I was writing about was over.
Okay. But the two aren't related.
One thing. Go ahead.
But there's no relation at all between the two.
No, I mean, I'm not sure what you mean by the Dixie Mafia. That's kind of like a political machine. That's a different topic altogether. But I can say this, that when Winthrop Rockefeller became governor, and as I say, he had too much money to be swayed by political donations from Hot Springs or a white bribery. But he was threatened. He was threatened with assassination. And the interesting thing is that he had his his chief of the state police. He had to hire a new guy to run the state police because the old guy was part of the machine, basically, or at least neutral between the two. So he had to hire a new guy to run the state police. It was a young guy in his early 30s who was formerly an FBI agent. And that guy didn't die until, he lived until I think 2008. But toward the end of his life, he was interviewed but by an academic type of archive, and he said that Rockefeller told him that when he got this threat, he said, "You tell that guy." I mean, after a few days, a few weeks, I'm not sure. He said, "You tell that guy that if anything happens to me or my family or you or your family, there will be revenge. And I've already contracted with the underworld characters who will execute it. It's not going to be the state police." So that pretty well made it clear to the Hot Springs underworld that you can't mess with this guy. You just can't do it.
Right.
I'm not trying to make Rockefeller a hero, but he just came in, he had the money, and he had been around the block. His family he was the grandson. He was one of the grandsons of John D. Rockefeller. So over that period of time, his family had dealt with every kind of person you can imagine. So when the underworld threatened him, he knew what to do.
So how did Rockefeller end up in Arkansas?
He was kind of the black sheep. I think there were 6 brothers: John D. Rockefeller, the third, and David Rockefeller, who ran Chase Bank, and Lawrence Rockefeller. Winthrop Rockefeller was kind of a playboy, and so he married some socialite up in New York City, and after she had a child, she divorced him and took a bunch of money. Winthrop never graduated from college. So he went down to Arkansas. It was a place where he could be a big fish in a small pond, and he was. But of course, the state was heavily Democratic, and this was in the 1950s when the entire state, the entire South was that way. And so it took him a long time to have political influence. That's how it ended. And the things that were interesting to me about the period was the connections that Hot Springs had to some big time gangsters. And what my book does, in fact, all of the books that I've seen on the topic, it's different, is that I look at how Hot Springs gangsters and the gangsters that visited Hot Springs fit into the overall scheme of the American Mafia.
New York had its 5 families. Chicago, you had the Irish Mafia, and then you had the Capone organization.
Okay, my story, I do tell a little bit about the gangster era in the 1920s and the 19-teens. But my story really begins in 1927 when a guy named Leo McLaughlin became mayor of Hot Springs. And he was mayor for 20 years, and he had a political machine that was practically unstoppable. And he was a playboy. He was a lot like New York's Mayor Jimmy Walker. And in fact, Jimmy Walker would come to Hot Springs, and they would go to the horse races together. And I don't know what else they would do together, but they were together, and he was really just kind of a hinterland version of Jimmy Walker, who was the playboy mayor of New York City. Now, with respect to the Mafia, in the 1920s, the Mafia was focused on prohibition because the police did not want to enforce it. So it was hugely profitable, and the risks were minimal. And prohibition, the speakeasy and all that was all over the country. And so in New York City, it was initially fell under the control of 2 Sicilian guys. But they kept warring with one another, and they also would not let in other nationalities. They would keep other nationalities and Jewish people from the Jewish gangster mobsters out. But one of their younger officers, for lack of a better term, was Charles Lucky Luciano. Lucky Luciano saw that they were going to kill the goose egg, lay the golden egg. It was necessary to bring in other types of monsters so that everybody got their share, and they needed to stop the fighting between the 2 groups. So Lucky Luciano arranged to have one of the 2 guys assassinated, and he was planning to have the other guy assassinated, but that other guy realized Luciano was coming after him, so he tried to get Luciano assassinated first. Bottom line is Luciano struck first. Luciano became, in the late 20s, really the head of the American Mafia. And Luciano, by the early 1930s, Luciano ran the American Mafia. But he ran it as sort of a confederation. He didn't want to be the only kingpin with the ultimate authority because he knew that would make him vulnerable to assassination. So he was still the greatest among equals. And there were 5 families in New York, but he was still the greatest among the equals. In the 1930s, after Prohibition died, the Mafia needed to find another way to make money. And the way they went, what they decided to do was to focus on industrial racketeering. Like in that movie, the Marlon Brando movie, On the Waterfront?
Yes, sir.
They wanted to gain control of the labor unions, and they could take money out of the labor unions like Hoffa did, and then they could use the labor unions to extort money from legitimate companies. In the 1930s, after Prohibition, this was a big move by the Mafia, and Luciano was in charge of it. So eventually what happened is that a grand jury in New York City told there was a case made of industrial racketeering. The assistant prosecutor tried to get the grand jury to indict the Communist Party, whereas the real culprits were the mafia. He was basically crooked. He wanted to direct them towards the Communist Party because, it was un-American, and he wanted to blame them. They told him, they said, no, we want to go after the real people. We think the real people are the mafia. They persuaded the governor of New York to appoint a special prosecutor. That special prosecutor was Thomas E. Dewey. He went after Luciano, but he could not get him for industrial racketeering. He got him for compulsory prostitution, because the mafia also controlled prostitution. And when Luciano lived in the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, which was probably the prominent hotel in New York at the time on Park Avenue. His hotel suite cost him $7,000 a year, and this was in the early 30s. He had bribed the bellhops, the people at the desk, the guys out front that let people in from the cab. All those people were bribed to let him know if any stranger showed up looking for a guy named Ross, which was his fake name, or Luciano. So he got a phone call one day from the desk saying, there's some unusual guys here looking for you, and they're heading over to the elevator now. So he went to a freight elevator and got out. Bottom line is he escaped to Hot Springs where he was heading out, and he had his girlfriend, who was a Broadway showgirl, come with him, and they were in Hot Springs, living in the best hotel in Hot Springs, and he would conduct business over the phone. Then he took a walk along Central Avenue, which is where the bathhouses are. And he unexpectedly ran into a New York City detective who was there to extradite a thief who had created a theft in Yonkers, New York. That guy recognized him on the sidewalk, and he told Luciano, says, there's a big manhunt for you all along the East Coast. And Luciano said, okay, well, thanks for telling me. But when they met, Luciano was in the company of the chief of detectives of the Hot Springs police force. So that guy had obviously been bribed to help protect Luciano. And the New York detective said, there's a big manhunt for you all along the East Coast. And Luciano said, well, why don't you just tell him you didn't bump into me. You could just be silent about that. And he said, no, I can't do that because I'd lose my job and get other penalties. So bottom line is Thomas E. Dewey learned about it, and he called the governor of Arkansas and said, we want that guy here in New York. And in the meantime, Luciano was arrested but taken to a court in Hot Springs where he was given a slap on the wrist and put up and released on a $5,000 bond. And that enraged Thomas Dewey because he said, I'm holding some of his underlings here in New York on $75,000 bond, and you're releasing him on a $5,000. Bottom line is the Attorney General of the state of Arkansas had to go down there and arrest him, take him back to Little Rock, where the governor had an extradition hearing and extradited him to New York. He gets sent to New York. He gets convicted of compulsory prosecution. But the important thing is he was the biggest mafia guy in the 1930s and 1940s. And his story ended in Hot Springs.
That sounds like this would be a good place for us to pause. We will have a very brief word from our sponsor, the Barnes Review, and then we will be back with our guest, Phil Leigh. If you love listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, then I know that you'll love reading the Barnes Review. The Barnes Review is one of my favorite magazines. I began reading the Barnes Review long before they became a sponsor here on the program. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There's just not a more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So if you'll visit www.barnesreview.org, That's www.barnesreview.org. You can find out how you too can become a subscriber to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review by mail, or you can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review electronically in PDF editions. Or you can subscribe to receive both. That's what I do. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. We're back with our guest, Phil Leigh. So, Phil, of all of the big mafia guys, was Lucky Luciano the biggest?
Well, he was the biggest. He was the biggest guy in the mafia throughout the 1930s and until at the end of World War II. He was deported after World War II, even though he was in prison, because he helped during the war effort by providing peace on the waterfront, getting his mafia-controlled unions to cooperate, and also he helped provide some kind of secret information about Italy prior to the invasion of Italy. He probably arranged for some, spies and other assistance with natives of Italy to help the Allies as they invaded the country. But the other two big ones would be Ray Karpus, who was public enemy number one. He was the only guy to get to the highest status of public enemy number one that was ever taken alive. And the other one was Jelly Nash. Jelly Nash was a bank robber. I don't know if you're aware of it, but there was a massacre at the Union Station in Kansas City where 4 lawmen were killed along with Nash when gangster allies tried to rescue Nash from being taken to prison. That was a big deal. That happened in the early 30s, and at that time, no FBI agent was permitted to carry a gun because enforcement of, for criminal offenses was primarily in the hands of state and local authorities. But after three FBI agents were killed and 1 Kansas City policeman, J. Edgar Hoover said, my guys can carry machine guns. And he got the law changed in Congress that killing a federal officer was a felony that could be enforced by the FBI. So Jelly Nash was a big figure in the story. He was hiding out in Hot Springs when he was captured. The plan was to get him to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, which is a federal prison. On the way, they took a train to Kansas City. The underworld, through connections in Hot Springs, knew about this. They arranged for a car full of gangsters to try and rescue him at the Kansas City police station. The story went from, everything fell apart, and 5 people were killed, including Nash himself.
And then you had mentioned another gentleman, Ray, what was his name? Ray Karpus, you said?
The other guy that is significant is Ray Karpus, who was he became public enemy number one. He was the guy that was the only one to get to that high on the list that was not, but he was the only one taken alive. His claim to fame was primarily bank robbing and kidnapping. He was involved in 2 prominent kidnappings that became popular. The concept became popular after the Lindbergh baby was kidnapped in the early 30s. So he did a couple of kidnappings up in Minneapolis and St. Paul of major beer brewery heirs that they had connections with the underworld themselves. That's another part of the story that's interesting. Then he was involved in a payroll robbery in Youngstown, Ohio. One of the steel companies there, in those days, they'd pay their employees in cash. So they robbed the entire payroll. And they had chartered an airplane to take them to Hot Springs, and they hid out in Hot Springs. But gradually, the FBI and the postal inspectors tracked them down, and he had girlfriends. Ray Karpus his girlfriend was the leading prostitute in the city at that time, or the town at that time. he told him that the FBI and postal inspectors came to her brothel and were looking for him, and he better get out of town. He did that. She eventually was forced to, she eventually decided to tell the FBI where he was. He had gone to New Orleans because the FBI said, when you went with Ray Carpus and to visit your family in East Texas over Christmas, and you brought your niece back to this brothel, you violated, I think, the Mann Act. And for that, we're going to throw you in jail for a long, long time. So she decided to squeal on Carpus. And J. Edgar Hoover was actually involved in that arrest because he had been hauled in before Congress to justify the budget that he was asking for the FBI. And one senator said, you've been running this FBI thing here for 15 years or so. How many arrests have you made? What have you done? And it turns out he had never been in the field doing anything. And so he was very sensitive on that. So he arranged for this to be his big showcase, high-profile arrest. What actually happened was he had other FBI agents arrest him on the street, on Canal Street in New Orleans. And then after the convict or the gangster was safely, disarmed and in the hands of the other FBI agents, J. Edgar Hoover came out of hiding behind a car and said, "I'm J. Edgar Hoover, you're under arrest," blah, blah, blah. And
I remember there was a scene in the movie where Leonardo DiCaprio played Hoover. I remember that.
That's what happened. That's right. The guy he was arresting was Ray Carpus. Ray Carpus was in New Orleans because his girlfriend, the brothel owner in Hot Springs, where he was living with her, told her, "You need to get out of town." And they decided to go there. You're right. That was in that movie. I saw that movie too. So he was a big time. What?
Oh, go ahead with what you were saying.
Yeah, he was a big time gangster too that was impacted by this. Eventually, that case was a big one for Hot Springs because it blew the lid on the corruption in the town. The police chief, the chief of detectives, and the brothel owner were all convicted of felonies and jailed because they had been involved in helping Carpus stay hidden in Hot Springs. And they all were involved in helping him get out of town before, the feds closed in on him. So that really showed that the chief of detectives was crooked, and it showed that the chief of police was crooked. Right. And all this time, this Mayor McLaughlin still running the town under a political machine. I don't know how long you lived in the South, but in the old South, there used to be what they call a poll tax. And to vote, you had to pay your poll tax. But what McLaughlin and his machine would do in Hot Springs is the poll tax was like $1 or $2, and he was there from 27 to 47, and during that period, that was before computers and everything. So what you would do if you were, say, a farmer, and Arkansas was a rural state, farmers would go into the county seat, they'd pay their poll tax and get a receipt. Then when it came time to vote, they would take the receipt, which would authorize them to vote. Well, if they were farmers and it was 20 miles to 15 miles, whatever, to take the wagon and the mule into town, that was a hassle. So a lot of these farmers would go in and they'd pay the poll tax for themselves and their neighbors, and then take the receipts back and give them the receipts so they could vote when the voting time came around. And they'd be paid back. I paid, $20 for, 10 people to get poll tax receipts. Well, what McLaughlin and his machine would do, the casino owners, they'd buy hundreds of poll tax receipts, and then on election day they'd give them out to derelicts and prostitutes, unemployed people, attached with a $2 bill to go vote. Here's who you're to vote for, and it included both races, white and black. The McLaughlin, the casino owners that were black, they supported the machine. In fact, the guy, when they were eventually caught at this, the guy that had the most poll tax receipts was a black casino owner. He had hundreds of them. so he could go out and get people to vote for the man. And this is a town that, where you might have 10,000 or 15,000 votes total. So this was a big impact on the outcome of the election. So they controlled the voting and who would be mayor, who would be judge. All of these were elected officers, and all of these people, part of the machine, they complied with the wishes of the machine, and the machine wanted gambling in Hot Springs because it promoted the economy.
I'm guessing that the money to pay all these poll taxes and to buy all these votes was probably money that the mayor and the political machine was actually getting from these organized crime activities.
Well, they got the casino operators paid them. They had a guy that ran, that was kind of like the czar of the casinos. And he would tell every casino, here's how much you need to pay this month. And it was generally related to how many slot machines you had, how many poker tables, how many roulette tables, how many all that stuff. But it was certainly profitable. And the poll taxes, they were, they were pretty cheap. I had $1 or $2 for each vote, plus they only had to do that once every 2 years, And they only needed enough votes to win. They didn't need enough. And of course, they used all the other techniques of, stuffing ballots and all that stuff.
Right.
But the poll tax receipts gave them an edge. But what I kind of learned about the whole thing is that kind of like once it's government. Government employees don't really care that much who is governor, because they know eventually he's going to go away and things are not going to really change that much. So you have this, what they call the deep state, right? The deep state really controls things in their interests until something really radical changes. And in Arkansas, there just wasn't enough money to force a change until Rockefeller became governor.
So I know we're kind of getting off topic, but do you think that putting in somebody like Bill Clinton was kind of an effort to turn things back, or do you think that Clinton was just...
Well, the way things turned back was not Clinton. Oh, by the way, remember I told you that the owner of the bordello, the madam, she was dating Ray Carpus.
Yes, sir.
When they drove to East Texas to visit her family, they bought a Buick from Ray Clinton Buick.
Okay.
So he had, I think, the Buick Oldsmobile dealership in Hot Springs. And I don't know how old you are, but, in the 50s and 60s, if you owned a GMC, a General Motors dealership in any town in the country, you were a prominent businessman. So Ray Clinton owned the Buick dealership in Hot Springs. And his younger brother, I can't remember his name, I think it might have been Roger, but I may be getting that confused with Bill's half-brother. But Ray Clinton's younger brother was sent to Hope, Arkansas to run the Buick dealership down there. And that's where Clinton was born. He was born, his biological father died before he was born. So anyway, he was born in Hope. His stepfather, Clinton, was running the dealership in Hope, Arkansas, but could not make a profit. Presumably, but he had alcoholism, and he just was not a good businessman. They had to close the Hope Buick dealership and move him into Hot Springs too, where he worked for his older brother Ray. But it's true that when Ray Carpus and his girlfriend bought a car to get out of Hot Springs and visit her family in East Texas, they bought their Buick from Ray Clinton.
Okay.
Now, the way that McLaughlin was taken down was not like Bill Clinton. He was taken down after World War II when the veterans came home. And as you know, World War II was gigantic. This was happening in other parts of the country too. The veterans came home and said, we just fought a war to try and get rid of bad governments. And we got governments here at home that are controlled by machines where your vote doesn't count. So there were a group of veterans that came back to Hot Springs that we need to get rid of this guy McLaughlin. Whether we continue with gambling or not, he's just, your vote doesn't count. This is a machine, Well, it doesn't matter how you vote. He's going to do whatever he wants, and it was basically true. So this group of veterans were able to defeat him. It was a hell of a battle. It involved some pretty shady stuff and pretty scary stuff, but they were able to beat him. They didn't do the shady stuff, but they were forced to. When they were going around trying to get people to vote in the general election. In those days, if you won the primary, the Democratic primary, then you would only need token opposition in the general election. Well, in this case, they could not beat McLaughlin in the primary election. So they decided we're going to focus on the general election. We're not going to run as Republicans. We're going to run as independents, but we're going to focus on the general election. But they came close in the primary. And then once they came close in the primary, the citizens said, hey, we might be able to get rid of this machine. And so they were able to beat them in the general election. The truth of the matter is McLaughlin himself was not a candidate that year. He was not up for election until the next year, but they got rid of his machine underlings, like the judges and all that sort of thing.
Okay.
So that's how it got cleaned up. But what all they really cleaned up after World War II was they were able to get honest elections in the city. They did not get rid of the gambling. Only for a couple of years did the gambling go underground. It came back. It was a matter of economics. The residents of the city could not earn a living without it, so it came back.
Well, I know Hot Springs, Arkansas, but I know in Lake Charles, Louisiana, that once they started building the casinos, it was the same thing. I know the chief of police had told me that, the entire economy of the city and the city government and everything else begins to just wrap itself around that industry. Yeah, it becomes a financial necessity.
Yeah, when the thing is, Louisiana and Arkansas are similar in the sense that they're both poor states, but Arkansas was even poorer. I looked up the statistics during the 30s, 40s, and 50s. The per capita income in Arkansas was half that of Illinois, New York, Connecticut, places like that. Half of it. But yet, if you bought a car and still came from Detroit, it cost the same, right? So it was a poor state. There are some, I did find a lady who wrote a memoir about her dad, who was a bookie during this period of illegal gambling in Arkansas, in the Hot Springs. And he was forced after this election. The leader of the veterans was a guy named Sid McMath. After McMath won the election, he eventually became the governor of the state. After he won that election, he did shut the gambling down for a few years. But so her dad, instead of being a bookie, had to go into another business. So there wasn't any other business. So he decided to become a farmer. And her memoir of that farm that he ran was pathetic. He could not do anything right. As hard as he worked, and she said he worked really hard to try and make a go of it. He lost a lot of weight. His hands became callous, but he had no experience. And even if he had, it was a hard business to make a living in. So when gambling came back, and it came back slowly, in a furtive type of way, he went back into becoming a bookie. He was able to restore the family income, but then, he was getting older too, so he had a stroke and he couldn't handle the book anymore. He couldn't handle the mathematics, so he took a job in a turkey processing plant. It was just considered an economic necessity, but it also had its dark side, clearly, because it was all illegal. And since it was illegal, it meant somebody somewhere was getting paid something.
Right. I read years ago in one of Donald Trump's books, I think it might have been the one he co-wrote with Robert Kiyosaki on Why I Want You to Be Rich. But I read years ago in one of Donald Trump's books, he talked about that there are so many ways to legally make money that he could never comprehend why some people insist on making their money illegally. But he said that it's a mentality. He said that there are some people that's just, I guess, the way they're wired, and if there's an illegal way to make money, they're going to figure out, and that's what they're going to pursue.
Well, there's always a tendency to take the easy way. Like I pointed out during Prohibition, according to the research I've done, these mafia guys say it was really, really easy to make money during Prohibition. The people did not want to give up. That's why it only lasted 14 years, 12 years, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the state, the police, the local police, and virtually every state, and the big states too, New York, Chicago, California, they didn't want to enforce it, so it didn't get enforced. And there was so much money being made that a lot of people could be paid off. The other story that is pertinent to Hot Springs is that there was a big-time gangster in New York after Prohibition moved to Hot Springs. And his name was Oni Madden. And he was famous because he was the owner of the Cotton Club, which was the Harlem club where Duke Ellington became famous, and the black actress of that period, what was her name? Lena Horne, all those people. He owned that club. He owned a bunch of other business, but he made all his money in Prohibition. But he had 11 bullets in him. Somebody tried to kill him one time in a mass assault. He absorbed 11 bullets, but he was eventually thrown in jail for manslaughter because he had the guy that tried to kill him and killed. And when he got out, the parole board in New York said, you know, it's kind of murky, the details, because what had happened is he got out. He was on parole in New York City, but he took a vacation to Hot Springs. He met a girl down there, and he eventually got his parole transferred there. We were told that we'll let you transfer there as long as you don't come back to the state for any reason. If we see you here again, you get deported. And his name was Oni Madden. After he was involved in the background the whole time, so he also had connections with the biggest of the underworld characters. So if like when Luciano got arrested in Hot Springs, it was Oni Madden that got him the attorneys to represent him. It was Oni Madden that got his bail bond money put up, and who all knows what else Madden was doing behind the scenes to try and keep Luciano safe. But later on, I don't know if you're aware of the Estes Kefauver hearings in the Senate, the first hearings into organized crime in the early 50s. They disclosed the fact that there was a lot of illegal bookmaking going on with respect to horse racing, and so the horse racing book, the wire was run by a company called the Continental Press out of Chicago. Well, the disclosure basically forced them out of business, so they had to be to keep the bookies in business. New people need to come in and set up the race wires. The local bookies did not want to do it because they knew that the crooked mayor could only protect them from the state and local authorities, could not protect them from the federal authorities. And the race wire service was a interstate business, so that was an illegal federal deal. So that Oni Madden took that over, and he knew how to do it without getting caught, or he knew how to do it and prevent getting caught by whatever it took, threats, bribes, whatever. And he ran that business. How big it was not known. He was one of the biggest in the South. I don't know how big, but he was one of the biggest. And so that was a deal. Now the interesting thing is that when Kefauver, who was the senator from Tennessee, who ran the first hearings in the Senate in Congress against the mafia, this was in the early 1950s. Those hearings were televised, and 70% of the population was aware of them. This was so early, and not a lot of people had TV, so it was more people watched those hearings as they championship. That was the period when gangsters first started saying, I take the Fifth Amendment. So that's when that phrase became famous. Well, they focused in on one of the big gangsters was Costello. What was his first name? It wasn't Lou Costello. That's the comedian. Frank Costello. Frank Costello worked for Lucky Luciano. And so he was an underling. But Frank Costello was the model for the Marlon Brando Godfather. Brando's voice in that movie was a lot like Frank Costello's. Well, they got him before the Kefauver hearings, and people listened to his voice, and they watched the hearings, and it just became clear that this guy was a pretty evil character. Well, Kefauver also wanted to get Myer Lansky, who was the guy that ended up running the casinos in Havana. He wanted to get Myer Lansky, on television. Lansky didn't want to get on television. So what he did is, it turns out that when Estes Kefauver, who was the senator running the hearings in the Senate, he was a senator from Tennessee. He was a native of Tennessee. But when he was a young boy, he taught 1 year of high school. A young man, he taught 1 year of high school in Hot Springs. Myer Lansky had sent somebody down to Hot Springs. Myer Lansky was a regular visitor there too. Sent somebody to Hot Springs to buy up all of Estes Kefauver's IOUs. He did. Then he had a private meeting. Lansky, with his attorney, New York attorney, had a private meeting with Kefauver, showed him all the IOUs, and said, "If you put me in front of TV, all this is coming out." He was investigated by the committee, but he was not put in front of TV.
We're going to pause there because we need to break for a brief word from our sponsor, the American Free Press, and as soon as this little commercial is over, we'll be right back with Phil Leigh, and we'll be talking about the gangster connections in Hot Springs, Arkansas. If you're like me, and I'll bet you are because you're listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. You like to hear about the latest financial trends and to know what's happening around the world and right here in the United States, the things that can directly impact you, your life, and the life of your family. And if you're like me, you do not rely on the mainstream media to obtain this information because, frankly, you know that you just can't trust them. Fortunately, there is an alternative news outlet with a long-established track record for honesty and integrity, and that is the American Free Press. AFP is the preeminent alternative, independent news source for honest, hard-working, truth-loving Americans. AFP is the antithesis of the controlled, lamestream media. AFP is employee-owned and has been so since its founding. Because of that, AFP never has and never will allow advertisers or special interests or big money to dictate what appears in the pages of the American Free Press newspaper. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. AFP covers the stories and tells the truth that the lamestream media is frankly scared to touch. And AFP offers real, on-the-scene reporting and commentary, the likes of which you will never see in the Washington Post, the New York Times, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, or just about any other lamestream news source that you can think of. That's right, there's only one national populist news weekly staffed by an unsurpassed team of veteran investigative journalists who will dare to rip the veil off of many of the major news stories that are being censored and suppressed by the big money controlled media monopoly. And that's the American Free Press. AFP publishes exciting, in-depth, uncensored news and information that's grassroots and patriotic, information that Americans need to know in order to combat the growing police state. AFP stands firmly against the New World Order and against those who are working to establish a global plantation under the rule of a powerful few. In short, AFP is your voice. If you have any doubt why they want to silence AFP, you must be relying on the lamestream media for your news And folks, that's a big mistake. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press. Do it today. And we're back with our guest, Phil Leigh.
Could you tell us where do people go online if they want to read your blogs or buy your books?
Well, my blog, thank you for mentioning it, is civilwarchat.wordpress.com. But if you just put in Civil War Chat, Philip Leigh, in Google, it'll come up.
Okay. And
Civil War Chat, Philip Leigh, Leigh. Remember to spell it Leigh.
And that'll get us to your blog. And how about if somebody wants to buy your books?
Amazon or Barnes & Noble. Barnes & Noble has it in some of their physical stores. They both have them in their online stores. I think Apple's got them too.
So I hope that all of our listeners will put forth the effort to get onto Google or Bing or their search engine of choice at the close of this broadcast and look up Philip Leigh, Leigh, or just Phil Leigh, Phil Leigh, or type in Phil Leigh, Civil War, Phil Leigh, Devil's Town, Phil Leigh, Trading with the Enemy. And you'll be able to find Phil's blog, you'll be able to find Phil's books. Definitely worth reading, definitely worth the time you're going to take to look them up, and you'll be glad that you did. Unfortunately, we didn't have time to talk to Phil about his other books in this week's interview, but we will be doing so in one of the coming weeks here, probably about 2 weeks from now. I'll have Phil back on, and we'll talk about 5 or 6 of his other books that he's written about the War Between the States era, and we will also talk about his 24 articles that he submitted for the New York Times' Disunion series. And if you're in the Tampa, Florida area, and you'd like to have Phil come and speak to your group, he's always happy to do that, speaking at Sons of Confederate Veterans meetings, United Daughters of the Confederacy meetings, League of the South meetings. If you have a group that Civil War Roundtable, an authors group, a coffee group, a book club, you'd like to have Phil speak, reach out to him or reach out to us, and then we can reach out to him for you, but do have Phil come and speak for you. I'd also like to ask you to go to our Dixie Heritage website, www.dixieheritage.net. Some of you had reported last week that the site was down. We have corrected that. It was simply a matter of re-registering or renewing our domain name, and we've renewed it for 5 years now. So we're good to go. And so go to dixieheritage.net, and you can get a free copy of my book, The Truth About the Confederate Battle Flag. No cost, no obligation whatsoever. Just give us your email address, and I will send you a PDF file of the book that you could read on your phone, on your tablet, on your computer. And when I send you that, I will also sign you up for our weekly Dixie Heritage newsletter. It mails out every Friday, just chocked full of information, great articles, great stuff you'll want to keep up with. And so I know you'll enjoy receiving that as well. And so until next week, I'd like to thank you for being a part of our TBR Radio Presents, the Dixie Heritage Hour family. Thank you for taking the time each and every week to tune into our program and to hear about what's going on in our beloved Southland. If you will, take just a moment when you're on our website, drop me an email, drop me a line, let me know who you are, let me know where you're from and how you're listening to TBR Radio Presents, the Dixie Heritage Hour. And so as we're running out of time now, I'm going to leave you with these last few seconds with one of my all-time favorite songs, Maryland, My Maryland. Until next week, God bless.